They told him not to touch her, said one hand would cost him his life, and still, he reached out anyway. The wind carried dust across the open stretch of red desert, low and steady, whispering through dry grass and rattling against worn leather saddles. 30 yards ahead, a young Apache woman stood bound at the wrists, her chin lifted not in defiance, but in something quieter, something harder to break. Around her, 5 men in faded coats circled slow, boots grinding into the dirt like they owned it, like the land had already forgotten who it belonged to. Ethan Cole watched from the edge of that circle, hat low, shoulders still, the sun pressing against his back like a hand that wanted him gone. He didn't belong to them. He didn't belong to her world either. That was the problem with men like Ethan, no place to stand that didn't feel borrowed. One of the men laughed, low and careless, and nudged the woman's shoulder with the toe of his boot. She didn't move, didn't flinch, just looked past him, eyes dark as river stone, fixed somewhere beyond the horizon. That was when Ethan stepped forward. Not fast, not slow, just enough to be noticed. "Ain't your concern," one of the men muttered, turning halfway, hand hovering near his belt, but not quite settling. Ethan didn't answer right away. His gaze dropped to the rope cutting into the woman's wrists, then to the small piece of turquoise resting against her collarbone, catching light in a way that felt out of place in all that dust. A necklace. Simple. Worn. Important. He could tell. Things like that always were. "Rope's too tight," he said finally, voice even, like he was talking about weather. A couple of them smirked. One spat into the dirt. "She ain't complainin'." Ethan nodded once, slow, like he agreed. Then he moved. Just a step. Then another. Close enough now to see the faint mark where the rope had rubbed her skin raw. Close enough to feel the tension in the air shift, tighten, like something invisible had drawn a line between everyone standing there. "Don't," the first man said, sharper now. "You touch her. You answer to more than us." Ethan paused. For a second, it looked like he might listen. The woman turned, her head slightly, then just enough that her eyes met his. There was no fear in them, not the kind men were used to seeing. There was warning, yes, and something else. Something that said she understood exactly what would follow if he crossed that line. He held her gaze a moment longer. Then he reached out anyway. The rope gave under his knife with a quiet snap, fibers loosening like they'd been waiting for it. Her hands dropped free, but she didn't thank him, didn't step closer, didn't move at all. Instead, her palm came up fast, sharp, clean, and struck his cheek with a crack that echoed louder than any gunshot would have in that moment. The men laughed again, louder now, thinking they understood what they were seeing. Ethan didn't react, didn't raise a hand, just stood there, jaw set, eyes steady. The woman stepped back, breathing controlled, one hand already at her necklace, as if checking it was still there. But it wasn't. The turquoise piece had slipped loose when the rope fell. It hit the ground between them, half buried in dust. For a second, no one noticed. Then Ethan bent down and picked it up. That's when everything changed. The laughter stopped. One of the men shifted his weight, unease creeping into his stance. Another glanced toward the ridgeline, like he heard something the others didn't. The woman's eyes locked onto the necklace in Ethan's hand, something like urgency flashing across her face for the first time. "Give it back," she said, her voice low, steady, carrying more weight than the men's threats ever could. Ethan looked at the small piece of turquoise resting in his palm, felt the warmth it held, like it remembered the skin it belonged to. Then he looked up at her. Not past her, not through her, at her. The wind shifted again, bringing with it a sound from far off, faint at first, then clearer. Not thunder, not storm, something older. Something that moved across the land like it knew every inch of it. The men heard it too this time. Heads turning, smiles fading. Ethan closed his fingers around the necklace for just a second longer before stepping forward, holding it out. He didn't drop it, didn't toss it, just offered it back, quiet as the desert itself. And somewhere beyond the ridge, the sound grew louder. The necklace rested in his open palm between them, and for a moment, neither of them moved, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. The sound from beyond the ridge grew clearer now, not loud, not rushed, but steady, like something that did not need to hurry because it already knew it would arrive. The men shifted uneasily, boots scraping dry earth, their earlier confidence thinning in the heat as one of them glanced back over his shoulder and muttered something under his breath that no one answered. Ethan kept his hand extended, not pushing, not pulling, just offering, and the woman stepped forward one measured pace, her eyes never leaving his, her hand rising slowly until her fingers closed around the turquoise, but she did not take it right away. Instead, she held it there between them, both of them touching it for a brief second that felt longer than it should have. Then she pulled it free and slipped it back over her head, the small stone settling against her chest like it had returned home. "You should not have done that," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Not anger, not gratitude, something more complicated, something that carried weight. Ethan nodded once, like he had expected that answer. "Probably not," he said, his tone just as steady. The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of leather and distant smoke, and this time even the men who had been laughing before stood still, listening, because the sound had changed. It was no longer just movement. It was rhythm, hooves, many of them, measured and calm. One of the men took a step back, then another, his hand finally settling on his belt, though he did not draw anything, just needed somewhere to put his nerves. "We should go," another said, quieter now, the edge gone from his voice. But none of them moved far, not yet, like they were waiting to see if the moment would pass on its own. The woman turned her head slightly toward the ridge, listening in a way that told Ethan she understood that sound better than anyone else standing there. When she looked back at him, something in her expression had shifted, not softer, not warmer, but clearer, like a decision had been made somewhere behind her eyes. "Why did you stay?" she asked. It was not accusation. It was not curiosity. It was something closer to a test. Ethan glanced past her for a second, out toward the open land that stretched mile after mile, empty in the way only the frontier could be, then back to her. "Did not have a reason to leave," he said. She studied him, the silence between them stretching just long enough to feel deliberate. "You had many reasons," she replied. "You saw them," she added, her gaze flicking briefly toward the men who now stood quieter than before. Ethan followed that glance, then looked back at her. "I saw you too," he said. The words landed differently than anything else that had been said so far, and for a brief moment, the air between them felt heavier, like something unspoken had stepped into the space and refused to leave. The sound from the ridge came closer now, no longer distant, the rhythm steady and certain, and a shadow passed over the ground as shapes began to form along the horizon line. The men saw it at the same time, their bodies stiffening, the last traces of bravado draining away as they realized whatever was coming was not small, not uncertain, and not alone. One of them took his hat off, ran a hand through his hair, then put it back on like that might help him think clearer. "We were just leaving," he said suddenly, though no one had asked, his voice directed at no one in particular. Another nodded quickly, already stepping backward, eyes fixed on the ridge. Ethan did not move. The woman did not either. They stood there as the distance between what was coming and what was already here closed inch by inch. "If you stand with me," she said quietly, her voice low enough that only he could hear, "you will not stand alone." Ethan let that settle for a second, the weight of it, the meaning behind it, then gave a small nod, almost to himself. "Was not planning to," he answered. She looked at him for another long moment, searching, measuring, then turned her body slightly, not away from him, but not fully toward him either, as if making space without offering it completely. The first rider appeared at the top of the ridge then, silhouetted against the sky, still and straight in the saddle, followed by another, then another, until the lines stretched wider than the eye could count at a glance. They did not rush. They did not shout. They simply arrived. The men who had been circling before stepped back further now, forming no circle at all, just a loose scattering of figures unsure of where to stand. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, the leather of his boots creaking against the ground, but his hands stayed away from his sides, open, visible, nothing hidden. Beside him, the woman stood tall, the turquoise catching the light again as the riders above watched in silence. And in that silence, something changed, not loud, not sudden, but certain, like a line drawn long ago had just been stepped across without anyone saying a word. The riders did not descend right away. They waited along the ridge like a line carved into the sky, unmoving, unhurried, their presence alone enough to quiet the last whispers of dust across the ground. And Ethan could feel it then, not fear, not quite, but the weight of being seen by people who understood more than he did. Beside him, Nayeli did not shift her stance, her shoulders squared, her chin level, the turquoise resting steady against her chest, as if it had always belonged exactly there. One of the men behind them cleared his throat, the sound too loud in the silence, and took another step back, then another, until he was no longer part of anything that could be called a confrontation, just a man hoping distance might make him invisible. "We meant no harm," he said, though his voice lacked the certainty it once had, and the words seemed to fall flat before they even reached the ridge. No answer came from above, not in words, not in movement, only the steady presence of riders, who did not need to explain themselves. Ethan shifted his gaze upward, meeting the silhouette of the one at the center, a figure slightly ahead of the others, sitting tall in the saddle with a stillness that spoke louder than any command. The wind tugged lightly at his coat, carrying a faint sound of leather and quiet breath, and something about it stirred a memory he did not expect, something older than this moment, something buried under years of distance. He did not look away. "You understand what this means," Nayeli said quietly, her voice low enough to stay between them, but firm enough to hold. Ethan nodded once, slow, thoughtful. "Means I am standing where I should not be," he replied. She glanced at him, a flicker of something unreadable passing through her eyes. "It means you chose a side," she said. He let out a small breath. Not quite a sigh. "Did not feel like choosing," he answered. "Just felt like not walking away." That seemed to settle something in her, not completely, not enough to trust, but enough to stop questioning for now. Above them, the lead rider finally moved, not fast, not dramatic, just a simple shift forward that sent a quiet ripple through the line behind him, and one by one, the horses began their descent, hooves finding their way down the slope with practiced ease, each step measured, deliberate, like the land itself guided them. The men who had lingered only moments ago stepped aside completely now, clearing space without being told, their earlier words forgotten, replaced by silence that carried its own kind of understanding. Ethan remained where he was, his hands still open at his sides, his posture neither defensive nor inviting, just present. Nayeli took one step forward, then stopped, waiting. The riders reached the bottom of the ridge and spread out slightly, not surrounding, not pressing in, just forming a quiet line that marked the edge of something unspoken. The lead rider came to a stop 10 yards away, his gaze moving first to Nayeli, then to Ethan, and there was no anger in it, no immediate judgment, only a depth that made it clear he was not looking at the moment, but beyond it. Nayeli lowered her head slightly, not in submission, but in recognition, a gesture that carried respect without surrender, and when she lifted her gaze again, it held. "Steady." "He cut the rope," she said, her voice clear now, carrying across the space between them. There was a pause, brief but heavy, as the meaning settled where it needed to. The man on the horse did not speak right away. Instead, his eyes shifted back to Ethan, studying him in a way that felt like being weighed without a scale. Ethan met that gaze without flinching, not out of defiance, but because there was nothing else to do. The wind moved again, brushing past them all, lifting a thin layer of dust that caught the sunlight and turned the air golden for a moment before settling back down. "You touched what is not yours," the rider said finally, his voice calm, steady, carrying the authority of someone who did not need to raise it. It was not an accusation, it was a statement. Ethan nodded once. "I did," he answered. No excuse followed, no explanation, just the truth laid bare. Another pause stretched between them, longer this time, as if the land itself waited to see what would come next. Nayeli did not look at Ethan now. She kept her eyes forward, trusting something she had not trusted before. The rider's gaze moved between them once more, then settled. And in that moment, the tension did not break, it changed, shifting from something sharp and uncertain into something quieter, something that felt like the edge of a decision not yet spoken. The other riders remained still, watching, not intervening, not reacting, because this was not their moment to shape. It belonged to the space between a man who should have walked away and a woman who had not asked him to stay. And out there, under a sky that did not choose sides, that space held longer than anyone expected. The words settled into the dust between them, quiet and heavy, and no one rushed to fill the silence that followed. The man on the horse did not raise his voice, did not gesture, did not demand anything further, and somehow that made the moment carry more weight than if he had. Ethan stood where he was, the heat pressing against his back, the faint creak of leather and saddle echoing softly as the horses shifted their stance in the stillness. Nayeli remained just ahead of him, not shielding him, not stepping away, but holding her ground in a way that said the space between them now mattered. The riders behind their leaders stayed motionless, their presence forming a line that was not a wall, not a threat, but something closer to a boundary that could not be crossed without consequence. The men who had lingered earlier were now further back, nearly out of the moment entirely, their earlier certainty replaced with quiet observation, as if they had become witnesses to something they did not fully understand. The leader's gaze lingered on Ethan for another long breath, then shifted to Nayeli again, and something passed between them without words. Something older than this place, older than the dust and the heat and the lines drawn by men who believed they could claim land by standing on it. "You speak for him," the leader said, his voice even, not accusing, not approving, simply placing the truth where it belonged. Nayeli did not hesitate. "I speak for what I saw," she replied. The wind moved gently through the space, carrying the scent of sage and dry earth, and for a moment, everything felt suspended, as if the land itself waited to see what would be chosen. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, the movement small but deliberate, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the same calm it had from the beginning. "I did not know your customs," he said, not as an excuse but as a statement. "But I knew what was happening was not right." The leader watched him closely, his expression unchanged, though something in his posture softened just enough to be noticed by someone paying attention. "Many men say they do not know," he said slowly, "but they do not stay to face what follows." Ethan gave a slight nod, accepting the truth in that without argument. "Most men have somewhere else to be," he answered. That seemed to hold for a moment, the honesty of it settling into the space like dust after a passing wind. Nayeli turned her head slightly then, just enough to glance at Ethan, her expression no longer sharp, no longer guarded in the same way, but still careful, still measuring. She stepped forward half a pace, placing herself clearly between him and the riders, not blocking, not challenging, but defining where she stood. "He returned what was mine," she said, her hand briefly touching the turquoise at her chest. "He did not keep it." The leader's eyes followed that motion, resting on the small stone for a second before returning to Ethan. "And why did you return it?" he asked, his tone unchanged. Ethan looked at the necklace, then back at the man on the horse. "Because it was never mine to carry," he said, "no more, no less." The answer lingered, simple and complete, and in that simplicity, something shifted again, subtle but certain. The riders behind the leader remained still, but the tension in their posture eased, just a fraction, like a held breath released. Slowly, the leader exhaled quietly, the sound almost lost in the wind, and for the first time, his gaze lifted slightly, taking in the horizon beyond them before returning to the two figures standing in the dust. "The land remembers," he said, not looking at either of them directly now, his voice carrying outward as much as inward. "It remembers who takes and who returns." The words settled over the group, not as a judgment, but as something closer to a truth that did not need agreement. Ethan did not respond. He simply stood, letting the meaning find its place. Nayeli's shoulders lowered just slightly, the tension easing from them in a way that only someone watching closely would notice. The men in the distance shifted again, uncertain now of where they fit in what was unfolding. their earlier presence reduced to something small and distant. The leader finally guided his horse one step closer, closing part of the distance but not all of it, leaving space where space needed to remain. His gaze returned to Ethan, steady and clear. "You stand here without asking for anything," he said. Ethan nodded once. "That is right." Another pause followed, not uncomfortable, not strained, but full, as if the moment had reached something it had been moving toward since the first step was taken. Nayeli looked between them, then forward again. Her posture no longer caught between two worlds, but standing firmly within one that had just shifted. The wind moved once more, softer now, carrying less dust, and under that wide sky, the silence that followed no longer felt like a threat, but like something being understood without needing to be spoken aloud. The quiet held, but it no longer pressed down on them the same way. It settled instead, like dust after a long ride, soft and certain, and the man on the horse studied Ethan one last time before shifting his attention back to Nayeli. There was something different in that look now, not a question, not a warning, but recognition of a choice already made. Nayeli felt it too, the subtle change that did not need to be spoken, and her shoulders eased just enough to let the tension slip away without breaking the moment. The turquoise at her chest caught the light again as she drew a slow breath, her hand resting over it briefly as if grounding herself in something that had almost been lost. Behind her, Ethan remained still, not stepping forward, not stepping back, understanding that whatever came next did not belong to him alone. The leader inclined his head slightly toward Nayeli, a gesture small but filled with meaning, and she answered it in kind, her posture steady, her gaze unwavering. No orders were given, no commands spoken, but the riders behind him began to shift, their horses turning in quiet unison as if guided by something deeper than words. One by one, they moved, not retreating, not advancing, simply repositioning themselves along the open stretch, creating space where there had been tension only moments before. The men who had once stood so certain of themselves watched from a distance now, their voices gone, their presence reduced to little more than shadows against the far edge of the land. Ethan glanced toward them briefly, then back to the riders, then to Nayeli, and in that sequence, something settled inside him, something that had been restless for longer than he cared to admit. "You can leave," Nayeli said quietly, her voice no longer edged with suspicion, but not softened either. Just clear, just honest. Ethan considered the words, the open road stretching behind him, the familiar pull of distance and solitude waiting where it always did. He had lived most of his life answering to that pull, letting it guide his steps, keeping him moving, keeping him apart. But standing there now, with the sun lowering just enough to cast longer shadows across the ground, that pull felt different, not gone, but quieter. He shook his head once, a small motion, almost to himself. "Not yet," he said. Nayeli watched him for a moment, searching his face for something she could not quite name, then gave a slight nod, as if accepting an answer she had not expected but did not reject. The leader turned his horse slowly then, guiding it with a light touch, and the line of riders followed, their movement smooth and unbroken, like water finding its path. They did not look back. They did not need to. The space they left behind remained, open and quiet, carrying the weight of what had just passed through it. The wind moved again, gentler now, brushing across the ground and lifting a thin veil of dust that shimmered briefly in the late afternoon light before settling once more. Ethan exhaled, the sound barely audible, and shifted his stance, the stiffness in his shoulders easing as the tension finally released its hold. Nayeli stood beside him, not close, not distant. The space between them, no longer defined by uncertainty, but by something still forming, something that did not need a name yet. She glanced at him once more, her expression calm, steady, and said nothing. He did the same, and out there, where the land stretched wide and unclaimed by anything but sky and memory, the silence that followed did not ask for answers. It simply stayed, like a truth both of them had stepped into without turning away. The desert stretched quiet around them, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like something had shifted beneath the surface, something that did not show itself in sound or movement. but in the way the air settled against the skin, Ethan glanced toward the horizon where the riders had disappeared, the faint trail of dust already fading into the distance as if they had never been there at all, and for a moment, he wondered how many things out here left no trace except in the memory of those who stood still long enough to witness them. Nayeli moved first, not abruptly, not with urgency, just a small step forward that turned her body slightly toward the open land ahead, her gaze following a path that only she seemed to see clearly. "They will not return for this," she said. Quietly, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who understood more than what was spoken. Ethan nodded once, his eyes still scanning the horizon, then shifting back to her. "Was not expecting them to," he replied. There was no pride in his tone, no relief, just a simple acknowledgement of what had passed. Nayeli studied him for a moment, the wind brushing a loose strand of her dark hair across her cheek, and she did not move to push it away. "You stayed," she said, not as a question, but as something she was still measuring. Ethan let out a slow breath, his gaze dropping briefly to the ground before lifting again. "Did not seem right to leave before it was done," he answered. She tilted her head slightly, considering that, the turquoise at her chest catching the fading light again as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. "Most men would say it was done the moment the rope fell," she said. Ethan gave a faint, almost absent smile, the kind that did not quite reach his eyes but softened something in his expression. "Most men are in a hurry to be somewhere else," he said. The words hung between them, simple, honest, and for the first time since they had met, Nayeli allowed a small shift in her stance that was not guarded, not defensive, but open, just enough to be noticed. The silence that followed was no longer sharp. It was steady, like the land itself, and in that silence, the distance between them felt different. Not smaller, not larger, but defined by something other than suspicion. "There is water not far from here," Nayeli said after a moment, her voice calm. "A spring, half a mile east, hidden by rock." She glanced at him, her eyes steady. "You should drink before you ride." Ethan looked in the direction she had indicated, then back at her, and for a second, it seemed like he might refuse out of habit alone, out of the instinct that had kept him alone for so long. But that instinct felt quieter now, less certain. "You coming with me?" he asked, not demanding, not assuming, just offering the question as it was. Nayeli considered him for a long moment, the wind moving softly through the space between them, carrying the faint scent of water that only someone who knew the land would recognize. Then she gave a small nod. "For a short distance," she said. Ethan accepted that without question, without pushing for more, and turned his body slightly toward the east, his boots pressing into the dry earth with a sound that felt louder now that everything else had gone still. Nayeli walked beside him, not close enough to touch, not far enough to be separate, their steps falling into a quiet rhythm that did not need to be agreed upon. The land stretched wide around them, the sky deepening in color as the light softened, and for the first time since he had stepped into that circle of dust and tension, Ethan felt the road ahead was not pulling him away from something, but toward it. He did not look at her again right away. He did not need to. And beside him, Nayeli walked with the same steady pace, her gaze forward, her presence no longer something he had to question, but something he simply accepted. Out here, under a sky that held no promises, that was enough. The ground shifted from dry dust to scattered stone as they moved east, the rhythm of their steps adjusting without a word, boots finding steadier footing between low ridges of rock that rose like quiet guardians over the land. The air carried a cooler edge now, subtle but present, and Ethan noticed the change before he saw the source, the faint scent of water threading through the heat like a promise that did not need to be spoken aloud. Nayeli walked with the ease of someone who did not search for paths because she already knew them, her gaze scanning ahead, not cautious, not tense, just aware in a way that came from years of listening to a land that spoke without sound. "You travel alone," she said after a while, her voice cutting gently through the silence they had shared. It was not a question, but Ethan answered anyway. "Most of the time," he said. She nodded once, as if that confirmed something she had already understood. "That is a heavy way to move through the world," she replied. Ethan let that settle, his eyes drifting briefly to the horizon behind them before returning forward. "Lighter than most," he said. Naeli glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. Not agreeing, not arguing, just considering the difference between what a man says and what he carries. They walked a few more steps in silence before the sound of water reached them, soft and steady, hidden beneath the wind, and when the rocks opened slightly, the spring revealed itself, a narrow pool tucked between stone walls no higher than a man's shoulder, shaded just enough to keep the surface cool and clear. Ethan slowed his pace, taking in the sight with a quiet appreciation that showed in the way his shoulders eased, the tension of the day slipping off him piece by piece. Naeli stepped ahead, kneeling by the edge of the pool, her hand dipping into the water briefly before lifting it to her lips. Not rushed, not cautious, just certain. Ethan followed, crouching on the opposite side, his reflection faint in the rippling surface, distorted by movement and light. He cupped his hands and brought the water up slowly, letting it rest there for a second. Before drinking, the coolness cutting through the dry heat in a way that made him close his eyes for just a moment longer than necessary. When he opened them again, Naeli was watching him, not openly, not in a way meant to be seen, but he noticed anyway. "You've been out here long," she said. Ethan wiped his hands against his coat, then rested them loosely on his knees. "Long enough," he answered. She studied him for a second more, then looked away, her gaze drifting across the rocks as if reading something written there. "My people say the land shapes a man," she said quietly. "But sometimes, a man shapes himself to match the land so closely that he forgets he had another form." The words hung between them, soft but heavy, and Ethan did not respond right away. Instead, he looked down at the water again, watching the way it moved around his reflection, breaking it apart and putting it back together without asking permission. "Maybe," he said finally. Naeli stood then, brushing her hands lightly against her dress, the small movement sending a faint shimmer of water droplets into the air before they disappeared into the heat. She took a step back from the spring, her posture returning to that steady balance he had come to recognize. "This is where I turn back," she said. Ethan rose as well, slower, the moment stretching just enough to make the words feel final without sounding like an ending. He looked at her, really looked this time, taking in the quiet strength in her stance, the calm in her eyes, the way the turquoise rested against her chest as if it had never been gone. "You could walk further," he said, not pressing, not expecting. Naeli gave a slight shake of her head, a small motion but certain. "Some paths are not meant to be shared too long," she replied. The wind moved through the rocks again, carrying the faint sound of water behind them, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan nodded once, accepting what was given and what was not. "Then this is far enough," he said. Naeli met his gaze, and for the first time, there was no distance in it, no measure, no test, just a quiet understanding that did not need to be explained. She turned then, her steps light against the stone as she moved back the way they had come, not looking over her shoulder, not needing to. Ethan watched her go until the land folded her back into itself, until the space she had occupied felt like it had always been empty and full at the same time. Then he turned east again, the road stretching ahead, different now in a way he could not name, but did not question, and somewhere behind him, the sound of the spring continued, steady and unchanged, like a memory. The land would keep long after both of them had moved on. The sound of the spring faded behind him with every step he took east, replaced by the steady rhythm of his boots against dry ground, and for a while, Ethan did not look back. The land stretched wide and familiar again, the kind of silence he had always known, the kind that asked nothing and gave nothing unless a man stayed long enough to listen. But something about it felt different now, not in the wind, not in the heat, but in the way it settled inside him, like a space that had once been empty had quietly been filled without asking permission. He walked for what felt like an hour, maybe more. The sun lowering inch by inch until the light softened into something gold and distant, casting long shadows that moved with him instead of against him. His horse waited where he had left it earlier, tied loosely near a cluster of dry brush, head low, calm, as if it had never doubted he would return. Ethan approached without a word, his hand brushing along the animal's neck in a quiet greeting, the leather reins warm from the sun. He untied the knot slowly, not in a hurry, not thinking about where he would go next, just letting the moment settle the way the land always seemed to prefer. As he mounted, he paused for a brief second, his gaze drifting back toward the west, toward the rocks that now hid the spring, toward the path where Nayeli had disappeared without looking back. He could not see her, not even a trace, and yet the space did not feel empty. It felt remembered. He turned forward again, guiding the horse into a steady walk, the rhythm familiar, the movement easy, but the direction no longer felt like an escape. It felt like a choice. The trail ahead wound gently through low hills, the kind that looked the same from every angle until a man learned to read the small differences, the way the shadows fell, the way the wind moved across the ridges. Ethan had spent years learning those differences, trusting them more than anything else. But now, as he rode, he found himself thinking about something else, something that did not belong to the land, something that stayed even when the land fell silent. Her words lingered, not loud, not insistent, just present, like the sound of water hidden beneath stone. He reached up unconsciously, his fingers brushing the place where the necklace had rested in his palm earlier, feeling nothing there now, and yet the absence carried its own weight. A small rise in the trail brought him to a higher vantage point, and from there, he could see farther than before, miles of open land stretching under a sky that had begun to deepen into shades of amber and blue. And there, at the edge of that distance, he noticed something he had not expected, a line of riders, far off, barely more than silhouettes against the fading light. Moving not away, not toward, but parallel to his path. He slowed his horse slightly, watching them, the memory of the earlier moment settling into place. They did not approach, they did not signal, they simply rode, steady and silent, as if marking a presence rather than making one. Ethan did not raise a hand. He did not change direction. He only watched for a moment longer, then gave a small nod to himself. A gesture no one else would see. He understood. Not fully, not in words, but enough. The land did not belong to him, and it never had, but for the first time, it did not feel like he was passing through it unnoticed. It felt like he was being allowed to move within it, just for a while. He turned his horse slightly, adjusting his path without breaking stride, and continued on, the rhythm of hooves steady beneath him. Behind him, unseen now, the riders kept their distance, neither following nor leaving, just there, like a quiet acknowledgement that did not need to be spoken. And somewhere far back, beyond the hills and the fading light, the spring continued to flow, unchanged, unseen, carrying its quiet truth through the land as it always had, long before him, long after him, and in that wide silence, Ethan rode on, not alone in the way he once had been, but not bound either, just moving forward under a sky that held no promises, only space enough for a man to choose who he would be when no one was watching. The trail bent slowly south as the light thinned, and Ethan let the reins rest loose in his hands, allowing the horse to choose the steadier ground between low ridges that rose and fell like quiet waves frozen in time. The distant riders remained where they had been, neither closing the distance nor falling away, their silhouettes now softened by the deepening dusk until they looked less like men and more like part of the land itself, something that had always been there whether a traveler noticed or not. Ethan did not turn back again to check them, not because he forgot, but because he understood that some things did not need watching to be known. The air cooled with the coming evening, carrying a faint hush that settled into the spaces between sound, and as the first stars began to show faintly above the horizon, he felt the long day easing its grip on him in a way that felt earned rather than taken. A narrow pass opened ahead, marked by two tall stones standing like sentinels, their shadows stretching across the ground in long lines that pointed toward a darker stretch of land beyond. Ethan guided the horse through without hesitation, the sound of hooves shifting from dry earth to firmer gravel, each step steady and certain. On the other side, the land opened again, wider than before, and in that openness, he saw something that made him draw the reins just slightly tighter. not in alarm, but in recognition. A small fire burned low near a cluster of rocks about 100 yards ahead, its glow soft against the growing dark, and beside it a figure sat still, facing the horizon, as if waiting for something that had not yet arrived. Ethan slowed his horse to a walk, then to a near stop, studying the shape in the firelight without calling out. The figure did not move right away, did not turn, did not acknowledge him, and yet there was no surprise in the stillness, only patience. After a moment, Ethan dismounted, his boots touching the ground with a muted thud, and he led the horse forward a few steps before stopping again, giving the space the respect it seemed to ask for. The fire crackled softly, the scent of burning wood mixing with the cool air, and then, without hurry, the figure rose. Nayeli turned slowly, the light catching the turquoise at her chest, the same steady presence in her eyes, unchanged by distance or time. She had not gone far after all. She had simply chosen a different path to arrive at the same place. Ethan said nothing at first, and neither did she. The silence between them felt different now, not new, not uncertain, but familiar, like something they had already stepped into once before and recognized again without needing to question it. "You rode east," she said finally, her voice calm, carrying easily through the quiet. Ethan gave a small nod, one hand resting lightly on the horse's neck. "So did you," he replied. A faint hint of something touched her expression then. Not quite a smile, not quite surprise, but something that acknowledged the simple truth of it. The fire shifted, sending a brief flare of light upward before settling back down, and in that moment, the distance between them felt smaller without either of them moving. "The land bends," Nayeli said, glancing briefly toward the path he had come from, then back to him. "It does not always take you where you think it will." Ethan considered that, his gaze drifting toward the horizon where the last of the light faded into shadow. "Maybe it takes you where you need to be," he said. She held his gaze for a moment longer, measuring the words not for their meaning, but for the weight behind them. Then she stepped slightly aside, leaving space near the fire without offering it directly. Ethan did not hesitate this time. He moved forward, tying his horse loosely near the rocks before lowering himself to sit across from her, the firelight casting soft shadows across his face. Neither of them spoke right away. They did not need to. The fire crackled between them, steady and quiet, and above them, the sky opened wide with stars that did not belong to either of them, but watched all the same, and somewhere beyond the reach of the firelight, unseen but understood, the distant riders had faded into the night. Their presence no longer needed to be seen to be felt. The fire burned low and steady between them, its light moving in quiet patterns across the stones, across her face, across his hands resting loosely on his knees, and for a long time, neither of them spoke because nothing in that moment asked to be filled with words. The night had settled fully now, stretching wide above them, stars scattered across the sky in a way that made everything below feel smaller, quieter. As if the land itself had stepped back to listen, Ethan leaned forward slightly, picking up a small piece of wood and placing it into the fire, not to make it larger, just to keep it alive, the flame catching slowly, then steadying again. Nayeli watched the movement, not the fire, but the care behind it, the way he did not take more than he needed, the way he let things be what they were without forcing them into something else. "You do not ask questions," she said after a while, her voice soft, not accusing, not inviting, just observing. Ethan looked up at her, the light reflecting faintly in his eyes. "I learned a long time ago that answers come whether you ask or not," he said. She considered that, her gaze drifting briefly to the fire before returning to him. "And if they do not?" she asked. Ethan gave a slight shrug, the movement easy, unforced. "Then maybe they were not mine to have," he replied. The words settled into the quiet, and for a moment, the only sound was the soft crackle of burning wood and the distant whisper of wind moving across the open land. Nayeli shifted slightly, drawing one knee closer, her hand resting lightly against it, her posture relaxed in a way it had not been before. "My father watched you," she said, her eyes steady. "Not just today." Ethan did not seem surprised. He nodded once, slow. "I figured as much," he said. She studied him for a moment, as if measuring how Much he truly understood. He does not trust easily, she continued. Neither do I. Ethan glanced at the fire again, then back at her. You should not, he said. There was no offense in his tone, no challenge, just agreement. Naeli let out a quiet breath, something close to a faint exhale of acceptance, and for the first time, the edge that had always been present in her voice was gone completely. But today, you stood when you could have walked away, she said. That is not something we forget. Ethan shifted slightly, the words landing in a place he did not often let others reach. Was not trying to be remembered, he said. Naeli gave a small shake of her head, her gaze steady. It does not matter what you try, she replied. The land remembers, and so do we. The fire flickered, sending a brief glow upward that lit the space between them, and in that light, something unspoken passed again. Quieter now, deeper, not a question, not a test, just an understanding that had found its place without being asked to. Ethan leaned back slightly, his hands resting behind him against the cool ground, his gaze lifting briefly to the sky above, taking in the endless stretch of stars. You said earlier that some paths are not meant to be shared too long, he said. Naeli followed his gaze for a moment before looking back at him. That is true, she answered. Ethan nodded slowly. And yet, here we are, he said. A faint, almost imperceptible shift touched her expression again. Not quite a smile, but something close enough to change the air between them. The land bends, she said quietly, repeating her earlier words. Sometimes it brings two paths together for a time, not to change where they end, but to remind them they are not the only ones walking. Ethan let that settle, his gaze returning to her, steady and calm. And when the paths separate, he asked. Naeli looked at the fire, then beyond it, into the dark where the land stretched unseen. Then you carry what you found, she said. The words did not linger long, but they stayed, like the warmth of the fire against the cool night air. And neither of them spoke again after that. They did not need to. The silence held everything that had been said, everything that had not, and under that wide, endless sky, the two of them sat across from each other, not as strangers, not as enemies, but as something quieter, something that did not need a name to be real. The fire had burned down to embers, glowing low and steady, casting a soft red light that barely reached beyond the circle of stone, and the night had deepened into that quiet hour when even the wind seemed to move slower, as if the land itself had chosen to rest. Ethan remained where he sat, his gaze drifting between the fading coals and the dark horizon beyond, his posture relaxed but not careless. The kind of stillness that came from a man who had learned how to wait without expecting anything in return. Across from him, Naeli had not moved much either, her presence steady, her eyes thoughtful, as if she was listening to something beyond the sound of the fire, something carried through the night that did not belong to either of them alone. Morning will come fast out here, she said quietly, breaking the silence without disturbing it. Ethan nodded once, his eyes lifting briefly to the stars before returning to the ground. It always does, he replied. There was no urgency in his voice, no sense of needing to prepare, just the acceptance of something that could not be changed. Naeli watched him for a moment longer, then turned her gaze toward the east, where the sky remained dark but held the faintest hint of what would eventually follow. When it does, I will return to my people, she said. The words were simple, expected, and yet they carried more weight than they needed to. Ethan did not respond right away. He reached forward. Instead, nudging one of the embers lightly with a small stick, watching as it shifted, glowed brighter for a moment, then settled again. Figured as much, he said finally. There was no disappointment in his tone, no surprise, just acknowledgement. Naeli studied him carefully, as if searching for something beneath the surface of his words, something he was not saying. And you, she asked, will you keep writing? Ethan leaned back slightly, resting his hands against the ground again, his gaze drifting upward once more, tracing the faint lines between stars that had guided him for years without ever asking where he was going. That is what I do, he said. Naeli let out a slow breath, her shoulders lowering just enough to show she had expected that answer even before she asked. Some men ride to find something, she said softly. Others ride so they do not have to stop and see what is already there. Ethan glanced at her then, his expression thoughtful, not defensive, not dismissive. "Which one do you think I am?" he asked. Naeli did not answer right away. She held his gaze for a long moment, her eyes steady, searching, then finally shook her head slightly. "I think you are still deciding," she said. The words settled between them, not heavy, not sharp, just true in a way that did not need to be argued. Ethan let out a faint breath, something close to a quiet acknowledgement, and looked back toward the fire, now little more than a low glow against the dark. "Maybe," he said. The night stretched on around them, quiet and wide, and for a while, neither of them spoke again. The silence felt full now, not empty, carrying everything that had been said and everything that had not. After some time, Naeli shifted, rising slowly to her feet, her movement calm and deliberate. Ethan watched her stand, his eyes following without question, without resistance. She stepped closer to the edge of the firelight, the glow catching the turquoise at her chest once more, the small stone reflecting a faint shimmer into the dark. "You will not be alone when you ride tomorrow," she said quietly. Ethan frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in thought. "Those riders," he said. Naeli gave a small nod. "They will not follow you," she explained, "but they will be near, as long as you remain on this land." Ethan considered that, his gaze drifting once more to the darkness beyond the firelight, where nothing could be seen but something could always be felt. "And if I leave?" he asked. Naeli looked at him, her expression calm, certain. "Then you will ride alone again," she said. The truth of it settled easily, without weight, without regret. Ethan nodded once, accepting it for what it was. Naeli stood there a moment longer, as if deciding whether there was anything left to say, then gave a slight incline of her head, a gesture simple and quiet, yet filled with meaning. Ethan returned it without hesitation, the movement just as small, just as certain. And then she turned, stepping beyond the reach of the firelight, her figure fading into the darkness, not as something lost, but as something that had always belonged there. Ethan remained where he was, watching until there was nothing left to see, until the night closed around the space she had occupied, and when he finally looked back at the embers, they had dimmed further, their glow soft and steady, like a memory that did not need to burn bright to remain real. The embers dimmed further as the night carried on, their glow fading into a quiet red that barely held against the dark, and Ethan remained seated for a long while after Naeli had disappeared, not out of hesitation, but because something in the stillness asked him to stay just a little longer. The land had gone silent again, but it was not the same silence he had known before. It carried weight now, memory, something unseen that lingered in the space around him. He finally rose when the cold began to settle into the ground beneath him, brushing the dust from his coat with a slow, absent motion, his eyes drifting once more toward the direction she had gone. Though there was nothing to see, he did not call out, did not step forward, because some things were not meant to be followed once they had chosen their path. Instead, he turned back to the fire, nudging the last of the embers with the toe of his boot until they settled into ash. The faint glow disappearing as quietly as it had lived. The night wrapped around him fully now, deep and wide, and he moved with it, untethering his horse, the leather reins cool under his fingers, the animal shifting slightly as if aware of the change without needing to understand it. Ethan did not mount right away. He stood there a moment, one hand resting against the horse's neck, his gaze lifting toward the sky where the stars burned steady and distant, unchanged by anything that had passed. Beneath them, there was a time when he had looked at that same sky and felt nothing but distance, nothing but the reminder of how small a man was against it. But now, standing there in the quiet, it felt different. Not closer, not warmer, just known in a way it had not been before. He exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him without weight, and then he mounted, the movement smooth, practiced, the saddle settling beneath him as it always had. The horse stepped forward at a gentle pace, guided more by instinct than direction, and Ethan did not rush it, letting the rhythm carry him into the early hours of the night. The path ahead was barely visible, the land blending into shadow, but he did not need to see it clearly. He had walked enough roads to know that not all of them revealed themselves at once. As he rode, the faintest sound reached him from somewhere beyond the dark, not close, not distant, just present. Hooves, steady and measured, moving parallel to his own path. He did not turn his head this time. He did not need to. The knowledge was enough. They were there, just as Naeli had said, not following, not guiding, simply existing within the same stretch of land, a quiet acknowledgement that he was not unseen. The thought did not weigh on him. It did not unsettle him. If anything, it settled something else, something that had long been restless beneath the surface. He rode for what might have been miles or only minutes, time losing its usual shape out there, until the eastern horizon began to soften just slightly, the first hint of dawn pressing gently against the edge of the night. The stars dimmed one by one, fading without resistance, and the land slowly revealed itself. Again in shades of gray and pale gold, Ethan slowed his horse as the light grew, his eyes scanning the open stretch before him, taking in the quiet details as they returned. The rocks, the low brush, the faint tracks left by passing animals. And then, almost without meaning to, he looked to the side, toward where the distant riders might have been. For a moment, there was nothing, just empty land, open and still. Then, far off along a ridge, he saw them, faint shapes against the rising light, moving at the same steady pace, neither approaching nor leaving. He watched them for a second, then nodded once, a small motion, more to himself than to them. They did not respond, did not change their path, and that was exactly as it should be. Ethan turned his gaze forward again, the road opening ahead, not calling him away, not pulling him forward, just there, waiting to be walked, and as the sun rose fully over the horizon, casting long light across the land, he rode on, not carrying the weight of the past behind him, not chasing anything ahead, just moving within the space he had been given, steady and certain, like a man who had finally learned that not all roads were meant to be traveled alone, even if they led in different directions. The sun climbed higher, slow and steady, washing the land in a pale gold that revealed every ridge, every line carved into the earth by wind and time, and Ethan rode into that light without hurry, the rhythm of his horse matching the quiet certainty that had settled in him. The distant riders remained where they had always been, never close enough to touch, never far enough to forget, their presence woven into the horizon like something the land itself had chosen to keep. He did not look for them again, not because they were gone, but because he understood now that some things did not need to be seen to be real. The trail widened ahead, splitting into two faint paths that curved away from each other across the open ground, one leading toward higher rock and shadow, the other stretching into flat land where the heat would rise stronger by midday. Ethan slowed his horse as he reached the divide, letting it come to a natural stop, the animal lowering its head slightly as if it too felt the pause in the moment. He sat there for a while, not weighing the paths like a man choosing between right and wrong, but like someone recognizing that both would carry him forward just the same. The wind moved lightly across the ground, brushing against his coat, carrying with it the faintest trace of something he could not name, something that did not belong to the morning alone. He turned his head slightly, not fully, just enough to glance toward the ridge where he had last seen the riders, and for a brief moment, there was nothing there, only empty land stretching under the sky. Then, just as the light shifted, he caught the faintest movement, a line of figures turning away, not vanishing, not disappearing, simply choosing their own direction as he chose his. Ethan watched them for a second longer, then gave a small nod, the gesture quiet, unspoken, but complete. There was no need for more. He turned back to the fork in the trail, his gaze resting on both paths before settling without hesitation on the one that led into the open land, not because it was easier, not because it was harder, but because it felt like the road that asked nothing and offered everything at the same time. He shifted slightly in the saddle, guiding the horse forward, the hooves pressing into the earth with that same steady rhythm that had carried him this far. The moment of stillness passed without breaking, folding into the movement as naturally as breath. The land stretched ahead, wide and unclaimed, the sky above holding its quiet promise of nothing more than space enough to keep going. Ethan did not look back again. He did not need to. The path behind him was not lost, not forgotten, just finished in the way all paths eventually are, and somewhere beyond sight, beyond distance, beyond anything that could be measured, the memory of a woman standing in the dust, of a necklace returned, of a silence that spoke louder than words, remained not as something that held him in place, but as something that moved with him, quiet and steady, like the rhythm of the horse beneath him. The sun rose higher, the shadows shortened, and the world continued as it always did, unchanged and yet never the same. And out there, where the land met the sky without boundary, a man rode forward without needing to prove anything, without needing to take anything, carrying only what he had chosen to keep. Because out here, respect was not given in words, and it was not taken by force. It was seen, it was felt, and when it was real, it did not need to follow you to stay with you. It simply remained, like the land itself, quiet, enduring, and understood.